who has been providing us with great information, doing a lot of interfacing with the legislature, so when the time comes for questions, we could maybe call on any of his expertise in any of these areas. So won't you please welcome to discuss how do we do this thing called redistricting, Nick Harper.
Thank you so much. I'm Nick Harper. My title is Civic Engagement Director. I am technically a lobbyist, as full disclosure, but I also do a lot of non-lobbying things, specifically doing public education on public policy issues related to democracy, among many other issues. And I'm very happy and pleased to be here tonight to talk about redistricting in Minnesota and how it affects your voting power. So a little background about myself. I am an attorney by background. There's going to be a lot of legal stuff in here. So just don't be shocked by that, because it's kind of my background. So real quick, for folks who don't know yet, what is redistricting? Redistricting happens every 10 years after we do our census. Our census is when we count every single person who resides in the state of Minnesota, in the country, but Minnesota, we're only worried about Minnesota mostly. And after that census, the number of seats we get in Congress is redistributed based off of changes in population. So for example, Minnesota, last census, last cycle, we just barely squeaked by and kept 8 congressional representatives, which also means we get to have 10 votes total in the Electoral College. It's looking that this upcoming census, we may lose a representative in Congress, which also means we would be down to 9 electoral votes at the federal level. But in addition to reapportionment, which is where they redistribute which states get how many representatives for Congress, there is also redistricting. And redistricting is where states are tasked with drawing the lines for the maps for where legislators will represent what communities. And this happens on multiple levels. So states are responsible for redistricting congressional seats and state legislative seats. In Minnesota, there's also local redistricting. So county wards or county commissioner are redistricted by the county commission. For the city of Rochester, the charter commission redistricts the city council. And so there's also local redistricting in addition to what happens for US representatives and the state legislature. Also, I didn't go over this, but if anyone has questions, just go ahead and raise your hand and jump in. We'll be happy to answer those on our way through tonight. So, one thing to know is that every state has its own process for redistricting. There is a couple of rules set by the federal government, but not a whole lot. And the process itself of who draws the lines and how is really up to the state. So, I figured since I'm coming down to Rochester, I wanted to show folks a map of Rochester and what your districts were. Felt like that might be helpful for some folks. So something to know that maybe you don't know is that Rochester the city proper, is actually split into 4 separate House districts in our state legislature. 25A, 25B, 26A, and 26B. That also means that Rochester is split among 2 different Senate districts. So it's a little hard to tell. I apologize, I did not choose the color choice for this map, but the darker blue and the lighter blue, those are 2 different districts in Senate District 25, and then 26 is the darker green and the lighter green. So those are the 4 districts that represent the city of Rochester. If you live within the city boundaries of Rochester, one of your representatives is one of the 4 districts listed there. You can also see that there's also a different number of residents from each district who live in Rochester. So 26A has the most number of folks from Rochester, 25B as well. And then 25A and 26B, they actually share their districts with a lot of folks who that don't live within Rochester, the city limits specifically, so neighboring communities and towns. So that's what Rochester's district looks like if you're trying to get an idea of, well, what do you mean by a voting map? What do you mean by districts? This is how your community is split up for the state legislature. Now, redistricting is important because it affects political power. You have your power split up again to 4 different representatives in the state legislature and 2 senators in the state legislature. Gerrymandering is the manipulation of maps to change that power and manipulate that power. So it was named after Massachusetts Governor Eldridge Gerry, if you want to get pedantic about it. So we don't pronounce it correctly anymore, but Eldridge Gerry signed a bill that created a partisan district in Boston that was compared to the shape of a salamander. So Gary's salamander became Jerry's salamander, which became gerrymander. And it was back in 1812, so gerrymandering's been happening since almost the very beginning of our country. And I could pretty much guarantee you that Governor Gerry was not the first one to do it. He's probably just got the bad rap for being the most recognizable one. So the term is now used to describe this manipulation of district boundaries to draw a map that gives political advantage to a specific person or a specific group. So Governor Gerry drew his map to ensure that he could achieve some political goal in the Boston area. Gerrymandering also comes in many forms. The 2 that are most recognizable and most talked about are racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering. So racial gerrymandering is when the maps are manipulated in order to disenfranchise a group of a particular race or ethnic background. Political gerrymandering or partisan gerrymandering is when maps are drawn in order to give advantage or disadvantage to either an entire party or an incumbent candidate who affiliates with a specific party. Those are the 2 most popular. There are other types of gerrymandering, which I can get into later if folks have questions, but those are the 2 that are most brought up when we're talking about gerrymandering. Any questions so far? Okay. If you were wondering what that original gerrymander was, this is the salamander. I don't know why it has wings, but this was the original gerrymander, and this was a political cartoon that was drawn at the time to point out that the governor had drawn this very strange, meandering district, and why would he draw it in that way? Yeah. I also don't know why it has a speared tongue or any of that. It's quite the monster. So gerrymandering is bad if you couldn't get it from this photo. So why is it bad though? So manipulated maps result in unfair distribution of power. So if you are trying to disadvantage a certain ethnic group or you're trying to disadvantage a political party, then you engage in gerrymandering to ensure that they are never able to win. Or if they are able to win, it's very, very difficult. You've essentially rigged the game so that it's not fair. Why that is important is because the unfair distribution of power rigs the political process and creates unfair political outcomes, especially policy outcomes. So, for example, racial gerrymandering discriminated against voters of color, and this was really rampant until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which attempted to reduce the amount of gerrymandering and did a pretty decent job for a while. But racial gerrymandering made it difficult to progress on civil rights issues because there was no representation, there was no political power that represented the voters of color. I will say that there's still attempts to commit racial gerrymandering. Every single decade that we do this, there's always lawsuits alleging racial gerrymandering. And every single decade, some of those are found by courts to be gerrymandering. So what is redistricting? What does that look like? What do you mean by drawing the maps? What I mean is that there are 3 elements or 3 pieces of the process. First, who are the people? So who draws the maps and makes the decisions about where these lines lie? So this can be, different states do it different ways, and we'll talk about that momentarily, but you can have individuals that identify differently by party, individuals who have to be legislators, individuals who can't be legislators. It varies from state to state, and we'll get to that in a little bit. You can also have an advisory commission, which essentially advises the legislature, and the legislature still gets to make the last decision on whether or not a map will be passed into law or not. You also have independent commissions that can make their own decision, and whatever they pass is the law. Doesn't matter what the legislature's opinion is. The second piece are principles. So principles are sometimes known as criteria or standards. The principles are what makes a map fair or a good one. And we'll go over some examples of what principles are and what those look like, especially one that is very relevant to Rochester. And then we'll also, another piece is the process itself. So regardless of who draws the maps or what characteristics they think the map should have, there's also what is the process. What meetings are held, how many meetings, how are they announced, are they open to the public, are people allowed to meet and talk about the maps in private behind closed doors, what is the role of the public in making that decision, are they allowed to contribute in some meaningful way. So those are the three pieces of the redistricting process. This is Minnesota's experience specifically. So the last legislature approved congressional, not legislative, but congressional redistricting was in 1971. So what happened was, that's actually not entirely true, and I'll tell you the exception. Since 1964 is when the state of Minnesota was actually required to start doing redistricting, because 1964 was the court case, the Supreme Court case, Reynolds v. Sims. Reynolds v. Sims held essentially one person, one vote applies to redistricting. So if you are going to have a legislature or a congressional representation in Congress that meets the one person, one vote standard, you need to be doing your redistricting every 10 years after you do your census to ensure that you account for changes in growth or shrinkage of communities and population growth. Do we have a question maybe?
Yeah, question is, how often are we supposed to do that redistricting?
Mm-hmm.
And have we been doing it? Because it doesn't feel like we've been doing it.
Yeah, so you're required under Reynolds v. Sims, we're required to do it at least every 10 years. Some states have done it more often. However, I will say that that has sometimes been with malicious intent rather than benevolent intent. But in Minnesota, we're required by law, by the Constitution, to do it at least every 10 years after our census. And we have, technically. So why I say that is because our legislature has, we got another question.
I'm a county commissioner, full disclosure, you may or may not know. But what we've done, and this is, you're talking about the state and the federal, what we've
So
done
far.
locally, and I'd like you to comment on whether you think it's a fair process. I've been involved in one. We've got several other commissioners. What we've done for the local is we've taken our planning director and said, give us 4 or 5 maps, or drop some maps, do your thing, because he would know all the racial and the equality and you got all the rules that you had to follow. And he'd present us with 4 or 5 maps, and then we'd pick one. And that's what we would do.
So let me get through this one piece, and I'll answer that question because it's a great question that I love. It's like the whole reason I'm here tonight, is to help people understand this process and what it means for not only the state legislature, but also for your local redistricting. Okay, so the last, the last legislature-approved congressional district is in 1971, and then ever since then, it's always been the courts, because either the legislature chambers cannot agree on a map, or the governor vetoes the proposal from the legislature. So they've failed to do their jobs, in short story. And what's happened then is that we have to go to the court system, and somebody sues the state of Minnesota and says, you're required by the Constitution to do this every 10 years. The legislature failed to do its job, so now it's up to the court to ensure we're no longer violating the Constitution. The courts, over the last several decades, since 1971, have drawn maps to meet those basic legal requirements. So they're not in their heads thinking, what's the best map we could possibly draw for Minnesota to make the most representative system for our voters? What they say is, what's the least amount of change that we can do and then get the heck out so that we're not violating the Constitution? But they are not in there doing beyond that, looking for an optimal. They are looking for, how do I just fix what's absolutely broken and then get out? Because they believe that this is the job of the legislature, it's not the job of the court. The court's only job is to fix constitutional violations, and then we get out and go away. So the court has drawn the maps for several decades based off of the legal requirements, but it hasn't been, they have had public meetings, but it has been in a court setting. It has literally been a special judicial panel. It is not like a public committee hearing at the legislature or like with your county commission or your city council. It's a slightly different tone to the meeting sometimes because it is technically a legal proceeding. So this is actually a little bit of a lie because the legislature did pass in 1991 a set of maps, and the funny story is that Governor Arnie Carlson intended to veto that map and then didn't veto it correctly, so then he didn't veto it. There was still lots of litigation over whether or not the veto was a correct veto and whether or not the maps could be put into law, but eventually the court said the veto was not done correctly, you missed your deadline, the maps are passed. But I don't really consider that a success because that was totally by accident. So the legislature and the governor have failed to agree is really the key piece. It's supposed to be the legislature's job to draw it and the governor's job to agree, or veto, leaving enough time for the legislature to draw a new map or a better map. And there has not been agreement essentially since the first decade we were supposed to do this. Yes.
So, because it hasn't been done without the courts essentially since 71,
Mm-hmm.
you said that the courts typically do this as equal as they can get to population,
Yes.
right? When you showed us those maps of Minnesota earlier, or our area earlier, they
Mm-hmm.
didn't seem equal in population at all.
The numbers, yeah, so there's two pieces, and we'll get to that. There are some variations that are allowed, and the numbers that I listed on the slide were Rochester city residents, to be clear. And then I wanted to demonstrate, so the ones with the smaller numbers, so like 25A and 26B, I show that to say your district is shared with folks who are not in the city of Rochester. You share most of your district with neighboring communities that aren't within the Rochester city limits. But they still will be, including those other residents, approximately the same size as the other districts. And I say approximately, we'll get to that in a second. So I talked about the three types of, the three pieces of redistricting. There is the people, the principles, and the process. So the people, there are many flavors of redistricting commissions in other states. So you have independent commissions, which are appointed multi or nonpartisan commissions that draw the maps and approve the maps. That's currently being used in Arizona, California, and Michigan technically hasn't done it yet, I don't think. They passed it into their constitution, but they haven't actually done it yet. This redistricting cycle would be the first year that they've actually done it. You also have advisory commissions, which can be either appointed individuals or nonpartisan civil service staff who draw the maps and then present it to the legislature, and then the legislature says, we approve or we disapprove, try again. Iowa is an example of that. They have nonpartisan staff draw the maps. Maine and New York also do that. You also have commissions that are political appointees, so individuals that are named by legislative leaders to create the maps. This one, it's technically not in the hands of the legislators, but it's in the hands of the legislator's best friend, so is that really much better? So you also have the Legislative Commission, which is elected members of the legislature. So usually it's, one person appointed by the majority leader of the Senate, one person by the minority leader of the Senate, one person by the Speaker of the House, one person by the minority leader of the House, who make up a commission. Connecticut does it like that. And then you have political commissions, which are composed of elected representatives. So Arkansas, I think their governor, attorney general, and secretary of state, I think, make up their commission. So they've got something a little funky there. So there's many flavors of what states do. If they don't have the legislature outright draw it on its own, there's lots of other flavors of what redistricting commissions look like in terms of who draws the maps. So it sounds like with the county commissioners, what the county, it sounds like they've done is they've essentially said, we are appointing nonpartisan staff to draw some options, and then we will pick which one we like. And that to me sounds like an advisory, kind of like an advisory commission, although I'm using commission loosely a little bit, if it's essentially the planning director with his or her staff. But it sounds kind of like an advisory commission model where you've got nonpartisan staff who are drawing the maps and they present it to the final body, the county commission. How do you make a county commission nonpartisan? We've gotten that question a lot, and that's a good question because a lot of people say, you know, I've heard things about nonpartisan commissions, but that's just nonsense. Nobody's ever truly nonpartisan. Somebody always votes for a party when they vote for somebody on their ballot. And my response is, I think you're right. Everybody has somebody that they vote for, but the point is not to completely remove the partisanship or pretend it doesn't exist, because you're probably right. It will never not exist. The point is to minimize the influence of that partisanship over outcomes so the outcome is still fair and not driven by the partisan nature. The different commissions have done this different ways. All the commissions have had a balance of people affiliated with different parties in some way, shape, or form. So that might be 3 people who are affiliate with the Republican Party, 3 people who affiliate with the Democratic Party or DFL Party here in Minnesota, 3 people who don't identify with either of those major parties. You can also have members who have not been elected in office for some period, so kind of prevent people from running for office, leaving office, have been a legislator who's been a member of that party for decades, and then they leave their elected seat, but then they return to serve on the commission. There have been rules to prevent that so you don't have long-standing legislators drawing maps for their longtime colleagues. Inclusion of people with no party affiliation or preference, so I give that an example. Arizona, California, Colorado, and Michigan all do that. Not related to elected officials, so you know it's not you, but it also can't be your wife or your son. That's still kind of cheating. Have not been employed in politics, so that might be not a party chair or other party official or employed by a party, not a lobbyist, not a chair of a campaign for a candidate. Several states have that rule. And then you have a couple states that actually do a random selection. So either Michigan actually has a system where they just mail every voter, they just mail a random set of voters and say, do you want to be on this commission? And then you have other states like Arizona and California where there's an applicant system and they have to apply to be on the commission, and then they're selected somehow through a process. Yes?
With the proliferation of the software that's available to perform these functions and the growth of artificial intelligence, is there anybody who's actually looking at a computer system that would simply take the state of Minnesota and produce a map?
Are you saying there? Kind of. And I'll answer that question in a second too.
Okay, go ahead.
We'll get to that when I talk about the principles.
Okay.
So we've also had folks ask how a commission can be independent. Independent just says that if the decision is not subject to approval or modification by the legislature. Some states, they actually require a supermajority for technical corrections by the legislature. So Washington does that, which has actually happened in Minnesota. For the last 2 redistricting cycles, despite the court's best efforts, in the 2000 cycle, they actually split a housing development in half, like straight through the building. Because for some strange reason, the building sat on a school district line, and the court was not really paying attention to where the buildings were. It was just saying, let's just draw the line where the school district line is, because that's the easiest, and they accidentally split a building in half. So So the people who lived in the building came to the legislature and said, please fix that. The legislature fixed it, because the legislature in Minnesota gets to do that on a simple majority. But the funny story is that those same people came back to, when the courts had to draw the maps in the 2010 cycle, the same people came back to the judicial panel and said, last time you did this, you split our building in half. Please don't do that again. And that the courts did it again. So sometimes it's necessary to do some technical corrections. There also was a map that was passed in the, I can't remember which decade it was, but it required a lot of technical legal corrections because the maps are often described with legal descriptions of the property. And they got simple things like, instead of saying North Broadway, they said South Broadway or something like that. And so the legal descriptions of the maps weren't up to par, so they had to issue corrections over that. So it can get, sometimes you just need a little tweak. You're really genuinely not trying to be malicious. You just need to make sure that things are correct. And then sometimes with Colorado, the actual map is actually reviewed by the Supreme Court as well. So that's kind of some ways that a commission can be, who draws the maps varies in other states. Before we move on to redistricting criteria, I want to address more the issue of the county commission and what it has chosen to do. I think that it is prudent to rely on nonpartisan staff to do a lot of the technical work. Because, as you state, they'll be the people who actually know what the demographics are, where the city lines are. They're most familiar with the communities because they plan them, literally. Coming up with 4 or 5 different options depends on whether and what guidance you've given the commission, the nonpartisan staff. Because if you haven't given them any kind of guidance on what a good or fair map should look like, then you might get 5 maps that look very, very, very different. Whereas if you, for example, have some predetermined objective criteria laid out, you might get 5 different maps, but they'll look fairly similar. Because the communities of interest are probably the same regardless, but you've just tweaked it a little bit here and there to account for some other community of interest or some other criteria you're measuring against. So I think that would be something to consider, is have you given your staff a set of criteria to work towards on what a good map should be based off of. And we'll cover criteria next. I think that's especially important if it's just an advisory commission, because then your board of commissioners really can just say, well, I pick this one, and then it could be for a very partisan reason, or because they believe it gives them a political advantage, which wouldn't be ideal for voters, so to speak. I'm not saying that that's what is going to happen or what would happen, but I can see that being an opportunity that presents itself in that situation. Yes?
How often is keeping the districts true to the incumbents currently in office an issue in making them new maps?
I can't tell you exactly how often or where it has happened, but I can tell you that I know for a fact that it has happened at the legislative level in Minnesota. And that's one of the ways, that's a different type of gerrymander, is an incumbent gerrymander, which is to draw a map that benefits somebody who's already sitting in office and makes it difficult for them to be challenged by a primary challenger, or to lose their seat to someone, another candidate running in that race in the general election.
We have quite often had the converse, though, where you've had a guidance go out which says you shall not move an incumbent out of his district.
Yes, and that's I argue, and the league believes that that's a type of gerrymandering because you are protecting the incumbents then. Ideally, I think for the sake of the voters, if the whole point of redistricting is to draw maps that benefit voters, you should not be drawing a map that pays attention to a specific incumbent, because maybe that incumbent won't run in a year, or maybe it shouldn't matter on the specific incumbent so much as it matters about the voters. So criteria, which kind of goes to this issue about technology. I think I have a slide in here about technology. So criteria, there are a few criteria that are required by law. So population equality is one we've talked about. That one is required by the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. That's where the Reynolds v. Sim case came from. Equal protection requires that there's one person, one vote, and that requires that there be equal population for the districts when redistricting. For the congressional level, that has meant one person difference among the congressional districts in Minnesota, which is difficult, and people have felt very frustrated because they say, well, my county is split, or my city is split, or my township is split by the congressional district, and it's that way because there's probably literally no way to draw a map in Minnesota that has only one person difference between the 8 districts, but doesn't also split a township or a city up. So they have tried to do one person difference as much as possible. That's been the rule that the court has laid down over the last several decades. Legislative, under the law, there can be a variation of up to 10%, variation of population equity. The reason they leave that 10% is because there are other considerations that you might want to give, including these and some other ones on my next slide. So equal population isn't the only thing you're thinking of when you're doing redistricting. You're also thinking of these other criteria that will help voters feel represented and be represented. I would say in Minnesota, the courts have said that 10% is the rule, that if you go over 10%, we're going to assume that you're gerrymandering somehow, and that it's not equal population that meets the standards of that court case. In Minnesota, historically, we've stayed around 2%, is the number that the courts have gone with, and that the caucuses have proposed to the court in the past is stick around 2%. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 requires that states do not dilute racial, ethnic, or language minority groups of voters. So this is essentially the anti-racial gerrymandering provision. The Minnesota Constitution requires that our districts be convenient and contiguous. So contiguous means that it's one unit. You can't have Senate District 3 be 3 different spots that are disconnected. And then convenient, there's actually no case law about this. I've been looking around and it's hard to find. But convenient in other states, and I believe Minnesota has interpreted it this way as well, simply means that it's easy to get from one part of the district to the other part. So you can't, for example, put a district split in half by a river unless there's a bridge across that river. Or in other states, it might be, a mountain in the middle of the district, something like that. So it needs to be easy to get from one side of the district to the other. In part, that's to ensure that whoever is representing that district can meet with all their constituents equally, and their constituents can meet with them. So these are the ones that are really required by law, but there are other criteria that courts and states have used over the years that are not required, but have just been the habit or the policy choices of the states over the years. So one that has been very standard has been preservation of communities of interest. What is a community of interest? It is a community that shares an interest. I know that's not a very good definition, but that's because that's the answer the courts give. But what that means in practice is they share an industry, or they share natural resources, or they share some kind of other interest that makes them similar enough that there would be some policy goal that they might want to be represented in the legislature or in Congress. So the one that I use as an example is CD8 right now. That is, I don't know for sure because I was not in that room when it was drawn 10 years ago, but I would say CD8 is CD8 because it is a community of interest for the mining industry, for the upper Mississippi River Basin, for the Great Lakes, for the Boundary Waters. So there are a couple different communities of interest that really make up CD8 and why it's the top right-hand corner of the state and doesn't, cut across the entire full state. It's because the eastern side of the state has some slightly different interests than the western side. The western side tends to be more agricultural, which is why it's a long district down the state, because that's where all the agricultural interests are. Lots of farmers and meat packing, things like that. So there's different industry interests. And I want to be clear, when I say industry, I don't mean that in a shady, the companies are controlling us kind of way. I mean that there are voters who are employed by those industries and feel like they need to be represented in policy choices at the legislature or in Congress. There's also, I pointed out preservation of American Indian reservations as a separate one because different states handle this differently. Some states consider reservations to be a community of interest. Most do. Other states, there's one state that actually recognizes it on its own criteria. I want to point it out because we've actually seen this been problematic in other states where reservations have been split up into 3 or 4 different districts. So it's hard for the tribal community to get accurate or fair representation in their state legislature because the reservation has been split up so many times. Another big one, and this one is very common, is preservation of counties, cities, and townships. In Minnesota, we call them political subdivisions. So the idea is you don't want to have to split up a city more times than you absolutely really need to, because in a sense, that community, that city or county or township is in and of itself a community of interest. They all share the same streets, they all share the same city council, they all share some kind of interest related to that political subdivision, so it makes sense that you would keep them together. Yes?
So like Dodge has 4.
Dodge County.
Has
Mhm.
4 legislators. Like that
Mhm.
county, which has not 50,000 people in it,
Mhm.
has 4 legislators.
Yes.
How does that fit into like Dodge?
Yes. So in that, and it's funny you bring that up because my next slide is going to be something very close to that. I would say that when the map was drawn, whoever was drawing that map and making that decision was not, there was some other criteria they were, theoretically, there was some other criteria they were thinking about above preserving the county. They were thinking of, I don't know what that criteria would have been. I couldn't tell you, I wasn't in the room. But it does seem interesting to me that the county is split up into 4 different districts if it doesn't have to be. Now, there will always be split counties, right? It's not possible to have every county in its own district. You are going to end up with split counties. But my question would have been, if I had seen that map 10 years ago, I would have said, is there a way to draw this map and maybe split it up into only 3 districts rather than 4? Another criteria is no unintentional effect of bias for or against a party. So that has been, so you can have intentional bias towards a party, which is partisan gerrymandering, but you can also have unintentional effect. So we've seen in some states where maps that have been drawn in such a way that for some reason give a bias towards a party, even if there might not have been an intention to give a bias toward that party. And so one way that states have handled this is having a proportionality requirement to say if the statewide vote for statewide elections was 60% party A and 40% party B, then we should draw the legislative map so that 60% of the seats should go to party A and 40% of those seats should go to party B, so that there's proportional number of seats to the number of votes in races. That's for some people controversial, and not unreasonably so, because the difficulty is that the political parties in most states are not equally distributed across the state. So voters that affiliate with the Democratic or DFL party tend to congregate in urban centers. Individuals that identify with the Republican Party tend to be in the more rural areas, which means that it's more difficult to get a perfectly proportional state when voters are not equally distributed in that manner. So proportionality is controversial for some folks. There have been other ways to measure. I did not put the word proportionality because there's other ways to measure this. You may have heard partisan symmetry be one word that's been used. There have been a couple different measures that have been used to test this kind of issue. You also have compactness, which is probably one of the most common and well-known criteria. Just means that it shouldn't be a big, long, sprawling district. It shouldn't be a salamander. It should be small, compact. Ideally, so an ideally compact district is a perfect circle because the distance is the same from the center and everywhere else. You will never get a perfect circle district, but that's what we're looking for, is we're looking for things that are compact and close together rather than spread out and sprawling. Some people like competition. They want their districts to be competitive. That's also controversial because of the political distribution of voters. There will be some districts that will simply never be competitive unless you do political gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering. So competition, while interesting and worthwhile for a lot of folks, it doesn't make sense for every single district in a state because it's simply not possible. And then another one that's common is following natural geographic boundaries. So you're following where a river lies, et cetera. Simply because it's an easy, obvious line that it wasn't arbitrary. It already exists, so it's safe to use that as a line to use. Let me see if I can, no, okay. So I didn't put my technology slide in here, but the reason why somebody just can't sit down and draw that map with the computer is because of this criteria. The criteria determine what the map looks like in the end, especially the order of the criteria. So these four have to be, or these three are, well, four, if you convenient and contiguous are two separate ones technically. So these four are required by law, so they have to go as the most important criteria. The rest of these are all optional public policy choices that the state legislature or whomever gets to choose, and the order it goes in affects what the outcome looks like. So for Dodge County, preservation of that county ranked lower than some other criteria possibly. And so you can't just say, go draw the maps, because there's always the criteria you have to set. And even if you set that criteria in a specific order, there's going to be probably 5 or 6 options, even with set criteria, that you could come up with that still abide by the criteria, but are still slightly different. So you definitely will have staff, nonpartisan staff, and the party caucuses at the legislature drawing their own maps with technology. But technology is not the solution. It is simply the tool, and can be used for good or not good purposes, depending on the intent.
You underestimate Watson.
Like the Watson, IBM.
Watson, AI.
Yeah, I mean, you could tell a computer in theory to follow these criteria and just make the best whatever you think, but also Watson is like a one and only computer, and very few people have access to that kind of computing technology. So.
Well, and we also have learned that some of the AI stuff has the biased lens of the programmer.
Yes.
We've proven that
Yep.
through a variety of things, that the person who programs it with their bias
Yep.
on accident most
Yep.
of the time.
Yep.
But then you're looking at a computer that has
Yeah.
programmed bias.
There will always be some measure of human judgment necessary to redistricting. The technology is only there to assist in making those judgment calls, but will not replace those judgment calls. Okay, so back to Rochester. You are split up into 4 different districts. Why, I could not tell you, but you are split up into 4 ways that might be unnecessarily split into 4 different districts. I couldn't tell you what the reasoning was for being split into 4 districts, but I can tell you that I think you could have drawn Rochester in only 3 districts, but you're in 4. Can tell you why, but that's the case. So this is just an example of why that criteria really matters, is because Rochester has been split up, for better or for worse.
Well, some people have argued that the townships were very interested in keeping Rochester from becoming such a juggernaut. It's the problem of France with Paris, that Paris dominates, or even Minnesota and the Twin Cities, that the outer line thing. So I have heard that said by people who are smarter than me and with a much longer time frame, that in fact, that it was a goal of this particular way of doing it.
Yep.
And we've lived with it for a long time.
And I think that is interesting because that brings up that third piece of redistricting. What is the process? Because if that process had been out in the open and not behind closed doors, then you would have either been able to hear what the reasoning was, or if it was done with a specific intent, they would have been held accountable for it. So that's why that third piece of the process, where are the meetings, how open are they, who gets to participate, is so important, because that will also affect what the outcomes are if people have to be held accountable for their reasoning.
Now, Nick, one of the other issues that you didn't mention in your slides, which is interesting, is there has been sort of this discussion that you should redistrict in a way that disrupts the fewest number of people. Have you ever heard that? You know, and this is, again, I don't think this comes from any legal case, but it's sort of a, you know, one of these, it's best for the community. And people are very emotional when they get given to a different representative or moved from one place to another. So I do think that that's a criteria that has been kept in mind in the redistricting process.
Absolutely. That's actually been one of the main ones that's been used by the court in Minnesota, is to preserve they call it preserve the core of districts. That has been used in Minnesota. The idea is to not really shift voters around too much, although I will say that that's done by the court because their position is, it's not our job, we're not here to change anything except what's absolutely necessary to stop violating the Constitution, which is why preservation of cores of districts has been a criteria for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's a good justification for the legislature or a commission. The preserving cores of districts was done by the courts because it's the courts. If someone else is drawing it, then you would need to come up with a better justification, or at least justify why you don't want to disrupt voters when maybe you need to in order to meet the needs of the voters. Maybe there's a new community of interest that's sprouted up over the last 10 years that needs to be addressed. Let's start here.
It's funny to hear that, because the way I recall, and the commissioners, county commissioners, were not involved in this redistricting. It was a state legislature. But the way I recall it, and I could be wrong, you know, it's 10 years ago, is that the city of Rochester they were talking of having 3 legislative districts, but that would only be 1 senator, and then that other senator would have been more beholden to the townships or the rural people. So, and again, this is hearsay, so take it for what it's worth. Rochester wanted to have it kind of like this, so they had 2 senators that, you know, were representing Rochester. They kind of wanted it this way.
Yep.
I can't say if that's true or not, but that's what I recall.
So that would be the justification. The criteria that's used is you want to make sure that the city of Rochester has access to a chance of accessing 2 senators rather than really only having 1 senator and then not really having another senator to go to and having those voters disenfranchised. So that's quite possible that that was the reasoning behind drawing the map in this way. So, yes.
So I just think about Rochester in the last 10 years and the ridiculous amount of growth compared to the growth of the rest of the state. Does it ever just reach a threshold where it's like there are way more people here now than there were 10 years ago? So things will really dramatically shift just based on that population piece, and there's not a lot of other considerations that can go in?
Yeah, I mean, like the city of Minneapolis, especially when you get in the metro area, that's especially something that happens, is that the population will sprout so much in certain neighborhoods that you're going to have to change it because of the population equity issues. But it does happen in other locations, and especially it's probably going to happen in Rochester, St. Cloud, Duluth, because the population has sprouted to such a degree that they're going to need to contract the geographic size of districts to make them geographically smaller because the population density is so high in those districts. And that, which in turn means that some of the rural districts will expand in geographic size because their population density is so much lower.
So these areas that are 26B and 25A, is there an argument to be made that they're not convenient or competitive or whatever? I mean,
Yeah.
They don't seem to be very convenient.
Yeah, so they would be convenient in the sense that you can get from one side to the other pretty easily by a car, right? You're not like, you're not prevented. I hear you, right? I see you being like, in terms of what,
The argument that
yeah.
I would make is that, as an organizer, those things are very often called what we call drive-in knocks, where you gotta drive, get out, knock the door, get back in the car, drive some more, get out, knock the door.
Yeah.
Those aren't nice,
Yeah.
compact areas
Yeah.
where you can,
I will say, sometimes that's because they've prioritized preserving a city. Because sometimes you have cities that have this weird leg that's just kind of like out and about in a weird, strange shape. And it's that way because the city lines are drawn that way, not because of any funny business with redistricting. It's just that the city boundary is a very strange shape. And they try to follow, if they're trying to preserve the city, then they'll follow that city boundary. I don't know that that's the case
well, it's
here.
not the case here, obviously.
Yeah, I don't know that that's the case here, but but that's why folks will experience it in other places. You also have a couple of cities in Minnesota that have what's called an exclave, so it's not contiguous with itself. You have a city and you have the main part of the city here, and then there's the city boundary, and then you go outside that boundary and it's a different city or a township, and you go a little bit further, and then there's like a little bit of a dot that's part of that first city. Now, how you draw a fair map related to that, I thank goodness I'm not the person drawing the map, because I think that's a difficult case to judge, but that's, again, another reason why human judgment goes into it. Do you make that exclave part of the same district as the main part of the city, which means you're cutting up part of the city that's kind of sitting between the two? Or do you say, nah, the exclave is on its own and cut it off from the rest of the same city? That's a judgment you have to make when you're doing redistricting. I don't know. It looks like with this one, they try to, this appears to be some major road, would be my guess. So it appears that they're trying to follow some major road, which is sometimes they do that in order to not force people to cross a major highway or major road in order to reach the rest of their district.
Not a very big road.
Well, I didn't say that, but that's the reason behind it sometimes. Other times, though, highways and other methods of transportation have been considered a community of interest. So it's interesting because a highway can go both ways. It can be either a boundary because you don't want folks to have to cross it, or it can be the core of the district because it's considered the community of interest is the community that is next to the highway as a method of transportation. Yes?
When you say residents,
Yes.
is that eligible voters, registered voters,
Mhm.
adults?
In Minnesota, it is all residents. Yes, all residents, I believe, except some states when they are addressing the no dilution of racial, ethnic, and language minorities, they are required by law to use citizen voting age population, so adults who are citizens. But in Minnesota, historically, we've used all residents.
So it includes prisons.
It also includes prisons, which is another whole deal. And controversy with redistricting is because you have prisons where in Minnesota, those individuals are not eligible to vote because they, have committed a felony and therefore are not eligible to vote while they're incarcerated, which means they're counted in that community for census and redistricting purposes, but they don't get a vote, which means you have certain districts that have a prison in the geographic area, which inflates the number of makes it look like there's more voters than there really are.
Which means they have more representation.
Yes. Yes.
St. Cloud, Oak Park Heights,
Stillwater.
Mhm.
well, Stillwater, Oak Park Heights.
Our own federal medical facility.
So, okay, so just to breeze through in case anyone's interested in learning more or doing something with this information, the League of Women Voters does have what's called our People Powered Fair Maps campaign, which is that, gerrymandering, including computer data, I know I had it in there somewhere. Computer data and processes have provide additional ability to draw maps favoring a given group. Like I said, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It can make it worse in some circumstances, and we've seen it been worse in some states. So we've seen that gerrymandering is a problem. The Supreme Court in 2019 said that partisan gerrymandering could not be addressed or fixed by the Supreme Court. They said, I don't want to deal with that problem, go away. Which means which means it's incumbent on us as a state to fix and ensure that partisan gerrymandering never happens in Minnesota, and to end all gerrymandering and prevent it in Minnesota. So the League of Women Voters has our People Powered Fair Maps campaign. It is a 50-state campaign. Every single state is participating in this campaign. And here in Minnesota, we have 3 messages about why it's important to empower voters and end and prevent gerrymandering. The first is every voice matters and every vote counts. Every voice in Minnesota should be heard and every vote should be counted equally. And that every Minnesotan deserves the opportunity to participate in the redistricting process and have representation in the legislature and Congress. We also believe that voters should be empowered to choose, which means that elections should be determined by the voters, not by the politicians who draw the maps. And a special redistricting commission would empower those voters and maximize representation rather than allow elected officials to draw the maps that benefit them or their party or make other choices that aren't reflective of the voters. And we also believe that cheaters shouldn't win. That we should not be relying on politicians to fix redistricting because it's a little bit like putting foxes in charge of the hen house. Instead, we need to have an open and honest process with clear and impartial rules. So that's our position on what we would like to see in a different redistricting process in Minnesota. And we're trying to do education like this and engage the public. Yes, and I can't talk about legislation that's currently in the legislature if folks want to hear. Real briefly, I will say that there is not a lot of interest from the Senate right now. The House has struggled over 2 different bills, one by Representative Cleavorn, which has been supported by the League and Common Cause and a coalition that has called itself the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy. There's another bill by Representative Schultz, supported by Peter Watson, who is the former Senate counsel, literally the head lawyer in charge, nonpartisan research staff essentially, advising the Senate. They have slightly different ways of selecting commissioners and different criteria, principles in different orders, so there are some differences between them. One seeks a constitutional amendment to make it a fully independent commission, and one of them is just a statutory change. However, I will say that these 2 bills are not going to be the same ones that will be debated in the upcoming session. I know for a fact that we're going to see at least one new bill, or there's going to be changes to the current bills so that they look very, very different. So even if I did tell you all the details about these bills, it wouldn't matter because they're going to change. But I want to tell you about what the important part is, that there are more than one reform efforts being heard at the Capitol, and the League will be involved in monitoring those reforms. Yes?
And then are you going to tell us how we can support the League in doing that work?
Yes. Yes, yes I will. I would get to double check that I put that slide in there. Okay, so I also want to point out that it's not just this session. This session is what's important for legislation to reform it. After the 2020, if there is a constitutional amendment proposed, that goes on the 2020 ballot in November. Regardless of what happens, there's the actual official drawing of the maps in 2021. In the past, Governor Ventura did this. He had an advisory panel that advised him on the redistricting process. So there could be an advisory panel by the governor. In the last redistricting cycle, the League actually put together a shadow commission, which is where we had members of the community draw their own maps based off of criteria that were important to voters so that we could compare it to what the legislature was drawing. And then there also will possibly be litigation on either the reforms or if there's no reforms, the maps that get approved. So redistricting is not just the next 3 or 4 months, it is the next 18 months. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about redistricting. If you want to get involved in supporting our efforts with the League, thank you. So there are a couple, you can go to our website. On our website, I call it our issue summary page, but it's just, on our website, there's a tab that says where we stand, and in that drop-down menu, there is People Powered Fair Maps. And that will essentially just describes, it has that handout linked to on that webpage. It tells you what is gerrymandering, what is redistricting, what is the big deal here. There's also our action kit, which was just released last week, which is linked to on that issue summary page, and that is specific, tangible tasks that you can take steps to support reform in Minnesota if you're interested in seeing reform. And we have one thing that we actually have pre-printed postcards, and we will pre-stamp those as well. So if you want to send a postcard to, say, a county commissioner or a city council member or a state legislator, we would be happy to share those postcards with you so that you can use them. That's going to be part of our action kit, among many, many other things, including writing letters to the editor, having postcard writing parties, having educational events like this, etc. Also, if you want to drive up to the Capitol on February 14th, we're having our Day of Action. We're celebrating the 100th birthday of the League, and part of that will include reminding legislators what they can do, what the League has done for 100 years, which is empower every voice and every voter, asking them to do the same.
Was that 10:30 PM or 10:30 AM?
For sure, AM. I don't know who put that P there, but that's not right. They're going to get fired for that. And like I said, we're here to help in any way. If you want to get involved, you do not have to be a League member. I would love if you became a League member, but if you're not a League member and you don't want to become a member, we'll still work with you to work on this issue. We'd be happy to work with you. Yes?
Early on, you said the Charter Commission redistricted the city.
Mhm.
It doesn't. The city council picks its own wards.
Interesting. Oh, I must be thinking of just Minneapolis.
Maybe.
Minneapolis does have its charter commission do it. I think St. Paul has its charter commission do it. But I think it's different for the local.
Yeah, Rochester, I'm on the Charter Commission. And
Interesting.
we could increase the number of wards.
But you won't. But you don't draw the
All
wards.
of it, but the city council draws their own.
Interesting. My mistake. Thank you. Anything else? Happy to answer any question. What questions do you have for me? Yes.
With the role of the courts in this,
Mm-hmm.
does this come into play in terms of judicial elections at all? Is there any process to seek out the opinions of candidates?
Like judicial candidates? No, not to my knowledge. I cannot remember who does our judicial redistricting, but it is not through the same process. I do not believe it's the same process that our legislative is done. I actually can't remember who does our judicial redistricting in Minnesota. Is it the Supreme Court?
Judicial districts,
Yeah, judicial districts.
that's set by the court essentially.
That's my thought. So I'm wondering,
It doesn't change with the census, I mean,
I don't think so.
well, it's not tied to direction.
Yeah.
Once they're set for
There's
a
no
long time.
population.
I don't
where-
think so. I'm not as familiar with,
Supreme Court just establishes.
yeah. So,
They haven't changed.
any more questions for me? Yes.
Just real quick, I mean, obviously, I'm a commissioner, we've got 3 other commissioners here, Greg Wright, Mark Tynan, and Stephanie Podolsky. We think we've done a fair job. I don't know if you think it's fair or not. The last couple times we did it in 2001 and 2011. So, I mean, I think for congressional and state offices, you're on the right track. Maybe we're doing it wrong here, but we've had very little controversy.
Yeah.
So, but I would be interested if you think it's controversial on the local issues, the county commissioners and/or the city council. It would be good to. I wouldn't waste the time on a postcard. We're pretty easy to get a hold of.
Yeah. But now with, walking you through what the process kind of looks like and what those criteria are that are used and what redistricting looks like and is, I hope that's at least helpful in engaging those conversations with your county commissioners on the process.
Thank you very much. Our thanks to Nick, and thank you for coming down and sharing that with us from the State League. I want to announce that this program will be on the library website, so it will be available to be seen by the public. So if you have friends who ask you about this issue, or if you live someplace that has lots of people and you're looking for a program, you can replay everything you've heard here tonight for another group of people or for one person, or make your children watch it. Thank you for coming. Good night.